This episode may contain language or discussions that may be offensive or triggering. Refer to the episode summary for details. Welcome to the She.confidential podcast. My name is Charlene Ketchum, and this is an episode that y'all need. Y'all really need it. I am chatting with Ms. Irnise Williams. She is an attorney, educator, speaker, and healthcare consultant. And she is going to get y'all together about all of this misinformation related to COVID, HIPAA, and your employment. So, Ms. Williams, thank you so much for agreeing to chat with me.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. That video I did really took off, and it's definitely been a good conversation. So I'm really glad to come in and share in a different space because a lot of people were asking me about sharing in a different space. So I'm so glad you invited me to talk about it. So I'm really excited to delve in.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so you all in the audience, I think it was maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Yes.
So I've been following Ms. Williams, and she's on Instagram at your nurse lawyer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
At your nurse lawyer. So I have been following you for a while, and I just happened to see that you'd gone live, and I think it had the title in there like COVID and HIPAA, and I was like, oh, let me chime in because see, these folks got it all wrong because I'm seeing all over social media people are like, my job is violating my HIPAA and blah blah blah, and I'm like, y'all spelling it wrong. And you don't know that HIPAA doesn't even apply to your employer in most instances. So that was so on time. And I was like, I need to reach out to her because I've been having people reach out to me. And you shared a lot of information that I wasn't aware of, just the details, the latest guidance that we've been getting from the federal government. And so I said, I need to go to the professional, to the expert who's on top of this so she can help us get people together on this.
Yeah, super excited. I don't even know, it was definitely an off the cuff conversation. I think it was just the same frustration of misinformation and people's accusations and people arguing about things. And I'm just like, wait, I want you to be empowered by what you're speaking about and actually talk about what you know from a capacity of like knowledge and not what you've heard. And then that may also just realign your argument because you'll finally realize that you're not really, you don't know what you're talking about. And I don't want to say you're wrong, but you're not coming from a place of education and just misinformation, people repeating things over and over that aren't true. So, yes, where do we begin?
So first, let's talk about what HIPAA is. Because everybody's throwing it around there. So let's give people some background. What is HIPAA?
Yeah, so HIPAA is the Health Information Portability Accountability Act, and it essentially protects your specific protected health information. So anything that is related to your health, including your name, your social, any information you're giving to a healthcare organization about you, but it only covers healthcare organizations, some insurance companies, and then some vendors that they may work with. So if I'm sending your information over to a company that creates medication because I need that specific information, they have to adhere to those rules. But HIPAA only applies to really healthcare organizations and insurance companies and a few vendors. And so we have to be very clear that HIPAA is not a constitutional right. HIPAA is not a human right. HIPAA is not applicable to every employer. It only is really applicable to the healthcare organization. So anyone who violates HIPAA, it's really on the healthcare practitioner. So your job reaching out to your healthcare practitioner is not a violation of HIPAA. The healthcare practitioner sharing your information without your authorization is a HIPAA violation. And so we have to be clear who is in violation, what is in violation, and what situations we can kind of put ourselves in where we can decide like, yes, this is a violation or not, right? So your healthcare provider is asking you questions about your health, about your vaccination status is not a violation. Your organization asking you about your health status, specific basic questions that are within their rights as an employer is not a violation of HIPAA. If you choose not to answer, if you choose not to, respond, that is one thing. But the asking of the question is not the violation. And so I think that is where it really starts. One, HIPAA really only covers specific protected health information. And that really is identifiers of who you are. your name, your social, your address, your diagnosis, right? So we shouldn't be sharing your diagnosis or anything that's related to your health care. That is protected health information. You know, some of the things that we're describing in this situation, which is like your vaccination status, is not necessarily protected health information, especially in a pandemic when we're still under emergency use authorization.
And I think that's the part that people don't understand, and I get it. Because there are certain things that may not be okay or legal in other circumstances, but due to the public health concerns
Mm-hmm,
of the pandemic, there's a lot more latitude. And
mm-hmm,
even I think on your live, you mentioned like we're interpreting these regulations in real time.
mm-hmm,
These things are evolving, and we
mm-hmm,
only have so much guidance. And as the pandemic develops, hopefully years from now,
mm-hmm,
instances of COVID will be rare. And so there may be, the defense of an employer having
mm-hmm,
the latitude to make certain inquiries may be lessened
mm-hmm,
once the threat is lessened. But right
mm-hmm,
now, we're still in code red.
mm-hmm. Yeah, that is the big part. I think we forget that, yes, usually an employer who is not in a healthcare setting wouldn't necessarily ask you about your immunizations, right? I feel like mostly people who work in healthcare or work in a healthcare setting are the only people, like I get tested to make sure that that I'm still immune to measles, mumps, and rubella, or to chickenpox. And I've got booster shots over the years because those that immunity had died because it was a threat to not only me but also to potential patients if I got chickenpox and then gave it over to a patient or anything like that. So we forget that healthcare workers have been kind of been tested pretty
For
frequently
years.
for years to make sure, and getting booster shots to make sure that we were still immune, including hepatitis B, like so many situations. And there have been times where we could opt out, but there are some that we just couldn't because it's just not safe. So the mandatory vaccination process has actually always been around in healthcare. You couldn't even get into nursing school if you didn't have certain immunizations. You couldn't get into college if you didn't have certain immunizations. And then even going to college, some people had never gotten their meningitis shot. They had to get a meningitis shot because if you're in the shower with people and you have an opening on your foot, you could potentially get meningitis, which could infect your brain or your cerebral system. And so we forget, or maybe you haven't been exposed to those positions or opportunities. And so this is not actually as new as people think it is. It is new for the public who are not healthcare workers, who are not in school or in college to have to be asked for that specific information. But it actually is critical. And we understand that in places where there have been outbreaks of measles, mumps, and rubella because they refused to get vaccinated, or in New York, it was kind of the same thing. They've had a few outbreaks because communities weren't getting vaccinated. We understand that that is actually the public is impacted by people's personal decisions. So just because you had a religious exemption from not getting a vaccination, it didn't mean that you weren't going to spread the disease to other people who either hadn't been vaccinated or had lost their immunity. We forget if you're not in a position where you need to get your immunity checked, yes, you may have been vaccinated as a child, but that immunity could have died down. And so when we began to see the impact, because I lived in New York at the time, of a community that was now infecting an entire city of measles, mumps, and rubella, and the outbreak was so heavy that it was shutting down schools and kids were in the ICU because those things come, it comes strong because they're like, oh, I'm out, right? I'm going to attack your body. I'm going to attack your immune system. And it was impacting us so heavily. We realized that just because you have a religious exemption and you are in one community, if you're taking the public transportation system, if you're in the grocery stores with everyone else, if you're engaging with kids at the park, you are now a vector and you're spreading a disease. And so that small situation and the situations that I think happened in Michigan and a few other northern cities and states where people were not getting vaccinations because they were essentially, deciding that it wasn't for them, it was having a public health impact. And so the rules were already changing before the COVID even came. New York City mandated flu vaccines a few years ago. And that year was our best year where kids weren't coming in with the flu. Kids weren't coming in with asthmatic reactions. People weren't sick and out of school. The disease really, 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 really heavily just, I don't want to say it went away, but it was just the low. That was the first year we were like, where's everybody at? We couldn't figure out
Yeah.
where the patients were. Usually between September, when kids are going back to school, all the way to
Mhm.
January, our clinic would be filled with sick kids.
Yeah.
None.
Flu and
So that,
RSV.
yes, and RSV season. So that one
Mhm.
mandate impacted a city so heavily. The delay in mandating the vaccine has killed so many people. The lack of control of this disease has had a heavy impact, especially on marginalized and systemically oppressed people, people who have received a lot of misinformation, a lot of miseducation, but also lack the resources and support to actually get the care that they need. And so I want people to understand that yes, you have rights. Yes, you have arguments and decisions for you to make. But when we're in a public health crisis, many of those rights that we have are kind of just lessened because now it's for the greater good of the people.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that's kind of missing in this whole vaccination discussion also is just the greater good component. Because I just saw Khloe Kardashian had put on Facebook or social media the other day. She said that she and her daughter, they're tested positive for COVID for a second time. And people said, "Oh, but they're vaccinated though. They're vaccinated." And so I saw comment after comment. I think it was like on
Mhm.
the Shade Room where I
Mhm.
saw this, and I just shook my head because I'm like, Lord, they're not,
Mhm. They
or
don't get
they're
it.
still not getting it.
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
they're not getting it. So can you briefly explain
Mhm.
what the vaccination, what protection the vaccination actually offers?
Yeah. So when we think about the flu shot, where most people don't get the flu shot in most places, when the flu comes, we can't necessarily specify which strain of the flu is going to come. We just take a general idea of what we potentially know is going to happen, and we create a vaccine every single year to fight that. For most people, it works. For some people, they may get a different strain and they still may get sick even though they get the shot. They may already be getting sick, get the shot, and then all of a sudden their immunity is a little bit impacted. And so now they're sick. Vaccines don't give diseases. Vaccines helps your body and prepares your body to fight a disease when it comes. So if there was a vaccine to fight the common cold, that means when you came across the common cold, you may get it bad or you may not. But it never would, it's not 100%. It's not a cure.
Mhm.
It is not something that will keep you from ever getting sick again. It is something that helps just build up your immunity. So giving you the vaccine, it introduces a into your body. I want to say a fake. So for us, it was specified as a DNA or RNA
Mhm.
that says something's wrong. And it triggers your body
Mhm.
to say, oh, I've never seen this before. I'm going to build a system to fight this. And then they get there and they realize, oh, it was a false alarm. So they kind of calm down. So that's why people get the fevers and they get the body aches and they get the chills right after they get the vaccination if they've never had COVID, because essentially your body's like, I've never seen this before. So then if you come across COVID, you're exposed to COVID and you actually may actually get the disease, your body's like, oh, I've seen this before. I know this person. And this isn't good. They don't belong here. So they're going to attack the disease to, even if it tries, some of the pieces may get around, right? Some of the cells may get to
Mhm.
different parts of your body, but the bulk of it will actually be attacked by your immune system. Your immune system will be able to stand up and resist this disease that could essentially take you out. What was happening, or and still happens to people who are not vaccinated, they are essentially in a position where their body does not know who this person is, so they just let them in. And then they realize, oh no, like they don't belong here. And for some people, their body overreacts. So their body overreacts
Mhm.
and it shuts down their system because their body is creating so many cells trying to fight off this disease. For some
Mhm.
people, their body underreacts, where their body is like, I don't know if you belong here, but since you're here, get comfortable. And then that's how there's
Mhm.
all of a sudden you have pneumonia, you have blood clots, like your body, it's just attacking all different parts of your systems. And then for some people, your body's like, I don't think they belong here. And I'm not sure if they do, but I'm just going to attack it. And for those are people who would have healthier immune systems, where your body's now reacting and saying, this person doesn't belong here. I'm going to make sure it gets out of your body. You still may get sick, but you're not going to die. And so we don't know who body is going to react how, even if you have a good immune system, right? So we have seen people with healthy immune systems do well.
Mhm.
And then we have seen people with healthy immune systems not do well. We have seen the elderly who have not so good immune systems not do well and do well. So the disease is also so multifaceted. It's not reacting like traditional diseases that we can't even attack it in a traditional way. So the only normally we would say, let this thing ride out. Like, cool, you don't want to get the vaccine, no problem. We're gonna let this ride out. But now we realize we can't, because now the writing out is actually jumping on different people and saying, oh, you have had it, or you have some type of defense to it. So I'm going to mutate. And then when I jump onto the next person, I'm going to attack their system even harder. That is why we're asking people who are capable to get the vaccine to get vaccinated, because it essentially will eventually hit enough people and weaken where it'll either crawl into a dark hole and die, and then somebody will uncover it and it'll spread again, or essentially we'll get the vaccine under control to a point where we can specify all of the components and we can attack it directly. Right? That's the easiest way. I think the technical way, the way that people explain it, it feels like we're injecting something into your system that's not going to protect you and you're still going to die from COVID, which isn't true. Right? We definitely saw that when the vaccine started to roll out, that the numbers begin to drop. When people were social distancing and washing their hands and take precautions, the numbers begin to drop. When people thought like, whatever, enough people are vaccinated, I'm going outside anyways, even though I'm not vaccinated, we saw the numbers go back up. And so there's so much miseducation, misinformation. Until you've been in a hospital that is filled with COVID patients, you don't know what it's like. I've been there. I worked through the pandemic, through the height of it in New York. I worked through it through a very difficult time in Maryland. Both times it was absolutely one of the worst things I had ever seen. And I've seen a lot of bad things. I worked in a lot of places. I've seen cancer. It's different because my patient was doing fine 1 second. She's preparing to go home. She's almost done with her 10 days. She's still testing positive, but she's feeling better. She's eating and walking. And then she dies 2 days later. How? Her lungs were sounding clear. She wasn't on oxygen. She was eating, because we don't have enough information about the disease. I think what I struggle with a lot is that we've taken vaccines that we had no one explained to me what's inside measles, mumps, and rubella. No one explained to me what's in all of these different vaccines that I took growing up. It was like, my child needs the vaccine. Y'all been giving the vaccine for years. We're going to get the vaccine. There was so much research. Everybody, every scientist who could, it was all hands on deck to study this disease, to identify how we could potentially attack it, and then to create something so advanced and so specific that essentially it wasn't going to take you out, because we couldn't do that, right? Like, we didn't want to make it so strong. And so that's why people are stressed about getting a booster. If we would have made it so strong, we wouldn't know how people were going to react. And the last thing we do is want to give people the vaccine and they're laid out in the hospital still. That doesn't help anybody. So they probably, watered it down a little bit, enough to give people a little bit of immunity, and realizing, okay, we can make it a little stronger. And so now that's why there's a booster. And so I think
And
for
thank you for
people,
making that point though about the vaccine, because I initially was one of the people like, okay, how they get this so fast?
mm-hmm,
Because I'm a science-based person. Like,
mm-hmm,
people who are in the audience or people who know me in real life
mm-hmm,
know I worked in medical publishing for 20 years. So I'm
mm-hmm,
that person. I go to the science. I don't go
yeah,
to CNN or any of
yeah,
those talking pundits. I go to the science. I talk to clinicians and people.
mm-hmm,
This is their life. I'm talking to
mm-hmm,
people who are on the front lines like you, and
yeah,
I'm reading from what the scientific journals are saying.
mm-hmm,
And that's what educated me about the development of the vaccine. This
yeah,
wasn't something, y'all, they didn't come up with this in a few months or a year.
no,
They already had a basis for it
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
because,
COVID
coronavirus
isn't
is not
new.
new.
Yes,
It's not new.
exactly. Yep.
And like you just said, Ms. Williams just said, the entire scientific community stopped. They stopped working on cancer
Yep.
research. And y'all know how much goes into cancer
Mm-hmm.
research. They
Mm-hmm.
stopped working on everything.
To attack
And it was
us.
all hands on deck.
Mm-hmm.
Literally, the smartest people on the
Mm-hmm.
planet
Mm-hmm.
stopped everything. And they all came together to work
Yeah.
on this to fight this
Mm-hmm.
virus.
Yeah.
That is how we got this vaccine. So
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't something that any of the major drug makers cooked up in a
Yeah.
month's time,
Mm-hmm.
contrary to what you might see on a YouTube video
Mm-hmm.
or something. There was a basis for it because coronaviruses are not new. And you had
Mm-hmm.
the most brilliant minds in the world who stopped working on everything to
Yeah.
prioritize this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the power I think that we forget. I think that people forget that NIH and some of these global organizations that are doing research, that's all they do.
All
Like
they
if you've
do.
ever met people who are researchers, that's all they do. Like they
Mhm.
literally are testing constantly. We don't see
Yeah.
those final reports. We don't see those outcomes because
Mhm.
they're not really relevant to us every single day. But some of the
Mhm.
data and the information that was used was already in existence. And the
Mhm.
power of what actually has happened, unfortunately, the loss of life is heavy, but now we
Mhm.
have enough information and education to use this science and data to now begin to work on other diseases. Like they're working on an HIV vaccine. Like,
Yeah.
y'all, that is a miracle. They never received enough funding to do that before because HIV
Yeah.
hasn't impacted, right, the right groups of
Mhm.
people. And so
Mhm.
that's why cancer is such
Mhm.
a big money maker, is
Mhm.
because it's impacting everyone. HIV
Mhm.
and AIDS hasn't. And so HIV and AIDS has never been able to be funded fully
Right.
because it just wasn't that important to people.
Mhm.
And but due to the virus and due to,
Mhm.
all of the funding that was put into this research, we now have the
Mhm.
capabilities to use that science and to use that research to actually build other things that could potentially help us in the future. So I get it. I understand people's hesitancy. I understand people's struggles with the government and all of that. But I really want people to understand, if you are willing to not get vaccinated, but you're willing to take the monoclonal antibodies, that is also research. Like that is not something that we have a scientific basis of this works
Mhm.
100%. All of the medications that we were using to help fight the virus wasn't necessarily something that we had hard research on. It was
Yeah.
really like, we think this cocktail may work, right? And we're going to build it. But for some people it did, and for some people it didn't. And so my thing is, if you're willing to get the treatment, you should probably focus more on the prevention, because the treatment could really impact you even more. We're not sure how people react to those things. Getting long COVID is really, really heartbreaking and debilitating, but it hasn't necessarily been qualified as a disability. And so you may not be eligible for disability benefits. And it's already difficult to get
Mhm.
disability as it is. For
Yeah.
something as new as COVID, they're not necessarily handing out disability checks. So
Mhm.
the actual best way to prevent this from impacting you for a long time and for a lifetime and for the greater good is to get vaccinated.
Yeah. And thank you for mentioning the long haulers, because too often we focus just on the deaths. And I
Hmm.
don't mean that in a dismissive way, because
Yeah.
that's significant. But there are also a lot of people I know personally
Yep.
who survived COVID
Yes.
and are living with the effects of it today.
Hmm.
And it is impacting some of these people's ability to work.
Hmm.
And like you just said, people aren't employers. Now, to my knowledge, these folks haven't yet tried to apply for disability,
Hmm.
but people aren't accepting that once you're testing negative for COVID, people think, oh, you're over it.
Hmm.
You shouldn't still be having these issues.
No.
But some people are dealing with decreased respiratory function,
Hmm.
body pains and
Hmm.
aches, brain fog,
It's
chronic
heavy.
fatigue,
Hmm.
things that they never had
Hmm.
prior to contracting COVID.
Yeah.
And these are people who are testing negative for COVID,
Hmm.
who've been over it for months,
Yeah.
weeks, and they still have these consequences from
Hmm.
it.
Yeah, definitely. So much, so much. So hopefully that explanation kind of helped.
Yeah.
And I know, I think this conversation was really focusing on helping people understand their employer,
Yeah.
like, right, and understanding what should be happening. So if you're required to wear a mask in any place, even when places are saying that there are no mask mandates, if it's a private organization, not government run, they can still require you to wear a mask, because they, as an
Mhm.
organization, have a right to protect their employees, and that is in other people who may be in their in their space, or within their organization or building or wherever you are. They can still require that, right? So there are government rights, and there are people or government mask mandates, and then there's kind of the public and the private organizations, and so people can require that. So although schools are kind of under the government, right, they sometimes have
Yeah.
their own authority as well. State and local governments can also make rules and laws. So you kind of have to see what's going on. But I also want people to understand that not only is COVID happening, but flu season is here. And RSV has started extra early, and it's also rearing its ugly head. So understand that a mask mandate, even if it's relaxed, it may be in your best interest to continue to wear a mask because it may be healthy, to make sure that you're protecting yourself, maybe not just from COVID, but from flu and from any other common colds. Like, this is the first year my kids haven't really had many colds, and the one who does is because he don't be wearing his mask right at school. So I'm like, stop. Put your mask over your nose, right? And my little one, who is actually amazing at wearing his mask, hasn't been sick at all. And so, we have to think about those things as well, that it's bigger than just COVID, that it's actually other diseases that are out here, especially in this cold and flu season, that could potentially make you very sick and hospitalize you as well and expose you to COVID if you're in a place that is not necessarily separated by clean and dirty, or like COVID or non-COVID patients, which most places are no longer separating people like that. So,
Right. And weakens your immune system, because if your body just finished fighting a cold
mm-hmm.
or the flu,
Mm-hmm.
now your immune system is weak, and that makes it more vulnerable to
Yeah.
COVID.
Yeah.
So these precautions protect us against so much more.
Yeah. Wash your hands.
Um,
I just remind people, wash your hands. Overall, wash
Even
your hands.
before COVID, like
Yeah.
I would say all the time, folks are nasty. Like, I've been in the restroom and heard people just walk right out, or you just hear the water on for 5 seconds. I'm like,
Yeah.
this is why I don't do potlucks. And this was before COVID.
Uh-huh.
And
I
it's just
agree.
basic. Like
Mm-hmm.
the fact that the health departments were having to do videos on hand washing. Like, y'all, this is just me on my soapbox, but it's just like, why are we having to educate people about washing your hands?
Refuse to do. I'm like, E. coli. No? Okay. Okay. Yes. It's so like that. And I think that's the people are like, oh, I don't get sick. And I'm like, you probably been sick. You don't even realize it, because your body is just used to the foolishness that you ingest, right? If you eat fast food, if you are outside, like being on a plane, I'm like, I should have always been wearing a mask. Why would I want to be in this plane with all of
That's
these
true.
people and no mask with no air in it? Like, they have ventilation, but it's just nothing, all of the things. So for anyone who
Yeah,
is on the fence, like for people who are anti, that's fine. This conversation may not push them,
it's
but
not
people
for
who
you.
are just like, I need a little bit more clarity. I really do hope that this kind of information helps you understand the back end and the background of what's happening. And as employers, right, you have the right, if employers are watching, or you're employed by an organization that is not the government, they have the right to ask you to follow rules that would essentially help and protect the organization, because you are a liability, right? If you get COVID and die, they now have to pay out through your insurance. If you have insurance, right? They have to pay all of that out. You could potentially, your family could potentially sue them. They may have to be
Yeah.
responsible for some of the decisions that were made or not made based on their protocols and policies. So we forget that employers have to mitigate the risk. They have to make sure that their employees are protected, or whoever their customers are protected. And they do that essentially by following at least the minimum of try to wash your hands when you come in or use sanitizer, and at least wear a mask. Because if some employees say, hey, they didn't allow us to wear masks, then you're now in a position where it's like, how are you trying to not protect your employees? And now it's a liability. And this has actually happened. And I think people don't understand. So in New York, the first, what we call ground zero X, or patient X, was at a hospital. And that was the first hospital that I worked at during the pandemic, because it was hit so heavy. It was in the suburbs of New York. And the nurse won because she said, y'all didn't allow us to wear masks. We knew this. We did not know enough about it, but we knew that it was spreading. So even if we didn't know if it was airborne, even if we didn't know if it was droplet, we should have at least, at minimum, had on a regular surgical mask. Even if we didn't have N95s, a regular surgical mask could have prevented a lot of the spread of the disease, but essentially it almost wiped their whole unit out, except like two people. People ended up in the ICU. She ended up with long COVID. Her son and her husband ended up getting it. She just filed a workers' comp claim saying, hey, I'm out. I'm out of work. I need to get paid. I'm filing workers' compensation. They denied her workers' compensation, so she sued them. Not only did she win her workers' comp claim, she also won based on their lack of allowing them to wear masks. Knowing that that case was out there, the rules quickly began to change, because now people are in position to sue. They now have what is called precedent, right? They now have one case that says that this employee, or an employer, an organization, can be responsible for their lack of attention to protocols that should have been in place at minimum. A healthcare organization should have been smart enough to put on gloves. Again, we gown up for things that we don't know what's going on. Like, okay, somebody comes in here and they have some weird symptoms. Everybody put on a gown. Everybody put on a
All the
mask.
time.
So all of a
All the
sudden,
time.
this international global disease comes in, and we're like,
Mhm.
everybody's fine. Don't worry about wearing a mask. You're going to scare the patients. And now you ended up harming an entire hospital pretty much, because it spread so quickly from the units down to parking valet, down to people who
Mhm.
worked in the cafeteria, because we didn't
Mhm.
have those basic precautions. So that means anyone who wants to bring that type of lawsuit now has a case that they can stand on, even if it's not within their
Mhm.
circuit, even if it's not within their region. They can say, hey, this circuit, the Fifth Circuit or whoever decided that this is, that this was legal. I'm going to bring the same claim, and they can formulate the same arguments. So all of a sudden, the CDC began to change, OSHA, Department of Health. All of a sudden, we're starting to have conversations about what employers have the right to do, which were expanded because they wanted to make
Mhm.
sure that there weren't lawsuits flying around based on the lack thereof. And so this is why everyone who is saying vaccination mandates are illegal don't understand that this has been knocked down in multiple jurisdictions by different judges and all over the country who are saying not true, based on a case from 19, I think 18, where that the I think the smallpox outbreak happened, and the
Yeah.
court said the Department of Health or has a broad right, and they have the broad authority to put in whatever rules need to be put in to make sure that people do not die because of the impact that it's having on their community. And so we have to understand that on the judicial side, on the legal side, that the law and the judicial opinions that have already been written already stand on the side of public health, that the
Mhm.
agency rulings and the agency rules already stand on the side of public health, that the federal government's job is not to necessarily focus on you and your personal issues, but actually the greater good of the public health. And that is their job. And so we forget that our personal feelings and emotions, and my friend always says this, feelings aren't facts. They are not the arguments that you can bring into a courtroom. They're not arguments that you can bring to an agency hearing. You can't even sue the federal government for most things, anyways. So you can forget that, right? I'm surprised that there was actually a lawsuit that was actually won against the federal government recently, because it's almost impossible. It's
Yeah.
almost impossible. So
Yeah.
people's opinion about the federal government and their power, that is how we've structured our system, right? That is the checks and balances that we have. And so we have to respect and at least advocate for change, but that's not going to happen in this type of situation. And so that is what I think we need to understand, that our feelings and our emotions, the information that we're being provided by individuals who are not scientists, who are not healthcare workers, and even some healthcare workers who may be spreading misinformation, we have to understand that the authority that has been given to on the judicial side, on the agency and the legislative side, and then for the president and the federal government, like though everybody's in on the same page. We have to do what we need to do for the greater good of our country. And so unfortunately, it is very difficult for people to understand and respect. But at the end of the day, there aren't really many avenues. And although there have been a lot of people who received religious exemptions, that may slowly dissipate very soon, because what we're coming up against is that there's a broad, a few organizations or a few people who are saying, I'm going to give out religious exemptions to anyone who feels that they deserve them. And then when there's an outbreak, who's responsible? The religious organization? No, right? And so if we don't have anyone to hold responsible, if the liability that is now being incurred through the lack of vaccination is not being pushed on the organization or the religious organization, and you can't see the federal government, who is responsible? And so we forget that somebody has to be responsible. The responsibility and accountability and
Mhm.
liability has to lie with someone. And if we can't identify who, then that exemption probably will begin to be used or allowed to be used less and less over time.
Yeah. Oh, you were teaching. I
Mhm.
have two questions for you
Yeah.
before we wrap up. One, around that testing. So some employers are, in lieu of vaccination, they're requiring weekly tests. So I've heard a lot of grumblings about that
Mhm.
because some people are concerned that this is, the weekly testing. And I think it's due to the nature that it's sometimes conducted. So some employers are requiring them to do that on site. So people are saying, oh, that's violating my confidentiality. And And so, can you talk a little bit about
Yeah.
the legality
Hmm.
of employers requiring weekly testing and the manner in which they choose to conduct that testing?
Yeah. So under, I think the federal government has put out some rules that were basically giving employers the authority to put into place either vaccine mandates or reasonable accommodations for those who can't get vaccinated. So if you choose not to get vaccinated, the employer can put in reasonable rules. Weekly testing is not bad. I've heard daily. Some people were bi-weekly. So weekly testing is actually reasonable there, and it's going to be looked at under a reasonable standard. And so employers were given the choice. You can either mandate the vaccine, right? That is your choice. You do have the authority to do so. Or you can also put some reasonable accommodations for those who can't get the vaccine or choose not to or have a religious exemption. So whatever rules they kind of put in place for you to not get vaccinated, right? In lieu of getting vaccinated, you now have the option to do these other things. That's your right, and that's but their right as well. You have a choice. You don't have a choice. You don't have a right to employment, right? They don't have to employ you. There's a lack of understanding that you have a right to employ. Most states, I think about 42, are at will states, and the ones that aren't, they still can find a way to fire you anyways, right? Unless you're unionized, and even then, they can still find a way to fire you because that is their right as an employer.
Mm-hmm.
And so you don't have a right to work there. You have a right to not and take the vaccine. You have the right to stay home. You have the right to choose the other option, but you don't have the right to work there. So employers were given that guidance, as minimal as it is, a one pager, basically saying, okay, there may be some people in your organization who cannot get the vaccine for whatever reason. You now have the authority to put in reasonable accommodations if that is weekly testing. The issue with testing is, one, it's not all done the same way, right? The other issue with testing is that there are delays in returning results. So if you test negative every week and then one week you test positive and then you don't get those results until 3 days later, but you've already been in the office, we are now
Mm-hmm.
all exposed and we're back right where we were, where now we're in a situation where we have a positive person. And so you are more likely to spread the disease when you're not vaccinated. You are more likely to get the disease and not know that you have it, because at least if you're vaccinated, your body's going to start reacting when you do have get the disease. So it's a tough conversation because I understand people feel like, these are my rights. But what the federal government said is that vaccination status and COVID testing is actually a part of employee HR files. It is not a part of your healthcare or your private healthcare information. So your employer they may ask for a physical. A physical is part of your HR file. A physical is not necessarily a part of your protected health information because it's being requested by an employer. And so because it falls under an HR employee file designation, they have the broad authority to ask for it. They have the broad authority to store it, and it's stored specifically in your employee file. And so it is more of an HR issue than it is necessarily a medical issue because of the way they've designated the status for vaccination or for requesting or requiring testing.
See, sounds like a lot for
Overwhelmed.
employers to keep up with,
Mm-hmm,
particularly
mm-hmm.
small employers. And so that's where your
Yeah,
services as a
yeah.
healthcare consultant can
Mm-hmm,
be like really invaluable, because as we're having this conversation, and then just like as an attorney, like my
yeah.
focus in law school was healthcare law. But even with this, it's
Mm-hmm,
like unless you're staying on
mm-hmm.
top of this, it's kind of like the IRS.
Yes,
Unless you're on
yes.
top of the tax code like day to day,
Mm-hmm,
I'm gonna need you to find somebody who is, so you can stay in your lane,
mm-hmm.
because there's a lot of liability attached to this. Like, we have not begun to see
It's in the
the
pipeline.
onslaught of
It's
litigation
in the
that's going
pipeline.
to come from
I'm
COVID.
sure we're all
It's
backed up,
coming.
right? From just they're trying to get through
Yeah,
years of stuff that was already behind, and then they're more behind through the delays. So,
already.
and they have to
Mhm.
prioritize, but trust and believe. I've already heard unions asking for people's specific feedback on how they were treated, on if they were allowed to wear masks. Like large organizations may be going after um, employers and hospitals and healthcare systems and people who did factories that were kind
Mhm.
of shut down, all of those things. And so for me in my role, because I'm a nurse and I
Mhm.
have nursing experience and because I have this legal education and experience, I'm able to kind of come in and assess some of these challenges. So for people who have healthcare related businesses, you at least need to have some type of compliance and internal systems that you need. And that includes like your onboarding and your own HR files and what that looks like, policies and procedures, and how you're going to necessarily deal with COVID contracts, trainings, and required trainings like your HIPAA and OSHA annual training, and making sure also that your website is compliant with legal regulations that I think that we do not talk about or think about in the healthcare setting. And so I've created something called a healthcare business toolkit, which allows people to have those basic elements and tools so that then they can begin to build their internal systems. And if they ever have to consult with an attorney, they have what they need and they can just ask for a review. Because a lot of times attorneys don't understand healthcare, attorneys don't understand the nuances of healthcare and how do you kind of deal with the board or Department of Health or all these other different organizations. They don't understand scope of practice. And so they don't know how to draft the
Mhm.
contracts and agreements and all of the tools that are necessarily needed. So I gave people the basics and the foundation in the healthcare business toolkit. And then my consulting services. So I work with business owners who are mostly small business owners who are nurses, nurse practitioners, service-based businesses who are established, but they are like not sustainable. They are just struggling to turn a profit. They are struggling to bring in clients. They're struggling to do all of these things. And to me, more than ever, it is easier to run a business because of social media, because of YouTube and Facebook and all these amazing tools that you can be successful with less work, but you have to know what you're doing and you have to know how you're doing it. And so I built a 66-day consulting program, which is one-on-one where I come in and deconstruct your business, tell you what's working and what's not working, and we begin to build from a place of sustainability. Does this actually mean that you can do these things? And I think that's hard for many of us. We think of business and we think of ownership and we think of grind all day, all day. Yes. In the beginning, it's going to be a huge learning curve. It's going to be chaotic. It is, but it doesn't have to be that way. And it can't be that way forever because that's not sustainable. And so we go in and we build those tools specifically for you, and with you to make sure you have some of those elements. And so that's some of the things that I do is a lot of this one-on-one consulting for small organizations and then building resources and tools. So for healthcare workers who are still at the bedside and working in healthcare, and some of them are also dealing with these same challenges of like, what can I do or what should I do or how do I protect myself? I've built resources for them. So it's called the Healthcare Provider's Guide to Mitigating Malpractice. And it's all of these courses that outline
Mhm.
what medical malpractice actually is,
Yep.
what does it mean, what happens, helps you walk you through the process so you have enough knowledge that if you're in a situation, you know how to protect yourself, you know how to preserve your rights, you know how to document efficiently. And one of my most popular webinars that I did last year is called the Documentation to Avoid Litigation, because nobody knows how to document, right? We say document, document, document. And you're like, document what? Document this, document that. Some people are like, I'm not documenting anything. And some people are, I'm documenting everything. And both are wrong. You can't be in either camp. You have to document efficiently and effectively, specifically what needs to be done. And you don't understand that until you really know what needs to be looked for. So that course is also available. So if you go to yournurselawyer.teachable.com, you can access all of those tools. And then you can also reach out to me at irnisewilliams.com, where I can walk you through some of the tools that I have, do a consultation, and see where you are with your business, right? I think there are a lot of miseducation, misinformation, and confusion as to what's expected. And I think that we, as healthcare people who work in healthcare and people who are even just new business owners who have never started business before, we're overwhelmed with the amount of information that is out there. It's like you got to market, you have to, be an accountant, you have to be on social, you need to have a website. And like no one is really comprehensively telling you what you can do. Yes, you can go through, the SBA. There are free things out there. There are lots of resources, but a lot of times they're time consuming because they're stretched over a long period of time, and or they're just sporadic. So yes, people are offering free classes all the time about different aspects, but no one's giving you a comprehensive understanding of what it is and what does it take to run a business. And I tell people all the time, anybody can be successful at business, but you have to know enough to do the work and what needs to be done to actually make it make sense. And it's not just the taxes, it's not just establishing the business, it's really all of the in between, the marketing, the niche, your messaging, your pitching, how do you get referrals that actually helps build and grow the business. And we think that it has to be a large group of people. Depending on your price point, you may only need 10 people a month to actually buy your business or your service or invest into your business for you to be successful, for you to make six figures, multi six figures. There are millionaires who only have a few clients based on the price point of their service. And so I want to bridge the gap between people who just don't know. They don't know. They don't know where to start. They don't know where to look. People are sending them here, there, and everywhere. The bureaucracy or the paperwork is just overwhelming for them to get into any of
Right.
the programs that are out there. And so it's not as expensive as it is to work with a regular attorney, but you get some of that legal background and understanding, and you get some of those resources and tools. But more importantly, you get someone who understands what it takes to start a business, right? Some people can be, if I work at the SBA, I may not own a business. And so I'm telling you what it takes to start a business, but I don't own a business. I own a business, and I can tell you the highs and the lows, the good and the bad, and I can really share with you that insight. And also, right, I always tell people one of the greatest things about working with an attorney is our wealth of knowledge,
Right.
our resources. I can pick up
Mhm.
the phone and call my friend who's an employment lawyer
Mhm.
and ask a question for free versus you having to pay $500, $700 to ask the question. My resource, my network, you plug into that. Everything I do is cost effective and cost efficient because I started my business with my own money, right? Nobody funded me. So when I had a website, I didn't have $5,000 to put down for a website.
Mhm.
I didn't have $5,000 to hire a consultant. So I had to necessarily put the pieces together. And so that is kind of who I am and what I do. And when people, it's when we talk about healthcare and the healthcare side, it's because that's what I've done. Like it's natural. This is my life. I stay plugged into the process because those are my clients. But I also am really passionate about bridging that gap because there's so
Mhm.
much miseducation, misinformation, and just lack of knowledge and just lack of not knowing. And it's very easy for us as educated people to be like, everybody should know that. Everybody should know this is common knowledge. But in reality, that's not true. And it's not fair for us to gain that information and to keep it to ourselves instead of helping people get access, get information, get
Right.
resources so that they too can build
Mhm.
a legacy for their
Mhm.
family and be successful and build a
Mhm.
lifestyle that they love. Some people love being employees, but some people are not made to be employees. Lots of people, right? I thought I was a great employee, and I am a great employee, but I'm a better entrepreneur because, baby, I like my time. I went and walked around the block before this call. Like, I would have never been able to do that if I was working for someone else. And so I want to give people that gift of entrepreneurship and successful entrepreneurship that then leads to legacy building, that then leads to creating jobs in their community and jobs for their family. And they're able to build their wealth into whatever it is that they truly love and are passionate about. And so that's kind of, why I do what I do and why I'm always open to having any kind of conversation to identify to people. You don't have to be rich or wealthy to get into a life, right? I wasn't rich and wealthy when I went to nursing school. I wasn't rich and wealthy when I went to law school. But those skills and the life lessons that I've learned have now been applicable and are truly just really teaching others, right, that they can do the same thing, that it doesn't necessarily come from a place of privilege, that it doesn't take a lot of money to do everything, but if you have enough grit and a grind and a really heart to do the work, that you can kind of get it done.
Absolutely. And your passion just shines through for what
I
you do.
do.
And your
Yeah.
clients, anyone who collaborates with you, like they
Yeah.
really are getting like the best of all the worlds because I mean
Hmm.
your combination of skill sets
Hmm.
is just invaluable. And especially right now. Like
Hmm.
people need to work with someone who has your expertise because
Yeah.
again, just I mean, you having that experience on knowing how to start a business from
Hmm.
scratch on your
Hmm.
own and
Hmm.
develop those processes and systems that are
Hmm.
efficient. Because we
Yeah.
know being an entrepreneur, starting something, creating something from scratch,
It's hard.
the shit gets real. I don't know any other way
So
to put it.
real.
It gets so
Yeah.
real. And
It gets
working with
real.
someone who
Hmm.
understands that
Yep.
and also has that legal background and everything,
Hmm.
just and a lot
Yeah.
of healthcare clinicians, I've worked around healthcare professionals and clinicians for over half my life. And I think they're so often led with your hearts, and they don't often have that business acumen that they need. And that can get you caught up.
Mm-hmm.
in so
Mm-hmm.
many
And
ways.
I tell them all the time, you know how to be a clinician, you know how to take care of patients, you know how to, you understand customer service, you understand systems and processes, but you don't understand business, and your business will never be successful until you become a business owner, not just a practitioner and a clinician, and really take your head out of the weeds of the work and actually expand your mind into what needs to be done to elevate your business to a level where you can truly be sustainable. So and I really encourage my clients and others that people want to separate healthcare into this own silo, but healthcare impacts everything. And we know that now healthcare impacts our social justice and community justice and judicial justice system, right? And criminal justice system. Healthcare impacts, our education system.
Yeah.
Healthcare impacts every single thing that happens in our life. You don't have healthy people, you don't have healthy communities, you don't have healthy outcomes. And we see that in places who have food deserts, and we see that in places who lack transportation, and we see that in places who lack education, that healthcare actually is kind of the hub. And then in places where there's actually good access to healthcare, you have healthy communities and you have healthy outcomes. People can thrive and think when they're not afraid to go to the doctor. People can thrive and think when they're not afraid to go to the dentist. And so we, from a healthcare people, though, people look at me like, oh, you only work with nurses, but I work with other service-based businesses, and they're like, so much of what you say is applicable. I'm like, yeah, because healthcare is just a form of business. It's just a different type of business. But if you understand that healthcare actually is the center of so much of what we do, we would actually have better outcomes, because we wouldn't disconnect healthcare from housing or healthcare from any of the successful things we do. And as a business owner, your health and your wellness is key to your success. And if you ever hire, you need to make sure the health and wellness of your staff is key to your success. And you can only do that by having systems in your business that actually makes it efficient. Because if you're burning people out, if people aren't enjoying the process, you're going to lose out on the actual success of in the momentum that you need to build that success in your business.
Absolutely. So, y'all in the
Mhm.
audience, you hear this. You don't have to be a
Yeah.
clinician to work with Miss
No.
Williams. Reach
Come on
out.
over.
Reach out. Reach out.
Yeah.
All of her contact information will be in the description box for the
hmm
podcast apps and for those watching on YouTube and at
hmm
sheconfidential.com. Thank you so much,
Yes.
for
Thank
your service
you.
during this difficult time, and then just for everything that you're doing to really empower people to live their
Thank you.
dreams, make their
hmm
dreams happen, and just navigate all of this
Yeah.
because it's a
Thank
lot.
you.
And thank
Yeah.
you for
I'm
all you
so
do.
glad you invited me to share this topic. I'm so excited to share on YouTube, because people have been asking me to have this very conversation on YouTube and not just on Instagram or on like, I just love that it's shareable in so many different places. So I can't wait for this to be dropped and for people to really be able to embrace the information and understanding of what's valuable.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, you all, Miss Irnise Williams. Be sure to
Yes.
follow her.
Yeah.
Again, lots of great information on your Instagram
hmm
constantly.
Yeah.
So follow her for the great content. Reach out to her to
hmm
help you with your business. And I'm Charlene Ketchum, and this is She Confidential. Until next time.